So I'm now going to hand over to Nicky. So Nicky is really Nedbank's chief economist. She joined Nedbank in 2000. She's been with Nedbank for 20 years or so. And she's going to be talking through what she feels are the 5 key points that government needs to focus on to get our country on the right track. So, Nicky, I hand over to you.
Hello, everybody. Yes, I've been with Nedbank, actually, just to correct that, since the beginning of time. So, that's an extremely long period. So to start out with, yes, I was asked today to sort of identify 5 things very briefly. So the good news is the prophet of gloom is not going to be talking for a long period. 5 things I had to identify that I think government should do immediately that could potentially change the outcome for South Africa and put South Africa on a better footing to stage quite a strong recovery. So let's start with where we are now and have a look. Sorry, I'm just trying to control my mouse here. At the first thing that I think needs doing. I certainly think that in the case of South Africa, if you just read the media, you look at social media, you look at the official press, you just listen to your neighbors and to your colleagues and to your friends. The one thing South Africans have had absolutely enough of is corruption. We have spent over a decade in a situation where corruption has flourished, where public funds have really been siphoned off to the benefit of a few politically connected individuals. And that has done an enormous amount of damage to our institutions, to our state-owned enterprises, which, remember, provides the bulk of our economic infrastructure. In the process, we are now sitting with a long-term burden being placed on taxpayers that, in the case of South Africa, is a very narrow tax base. So the burden falls disproportionately on a few. And the outcome of it has, of course, been economically very destructive. So I think if there's one thing government can absolutely do to make an enormous difference to the South African economy and to confidence and to send a strong signal out there that South Africa is actually on the right path, it is to root out corruption and restore accountability. And those two go together. You can't just talk about rooting out corruption. You have to make an example of those that are guilty. So for me, one of the biggest channels through which corruption occurs in South Africa, it's almost been legislated into the system, is the tender system. So I would think that very clearly, one of the things that absolutely needs to be a rule is that no government officials, families, or government employees' families can actually do business with government, and elected politicians' families can't do business with government. Now, often that's said, well, that's unfair. No, it's not. It's a rule all over the world. So if you want to work for government, that's one of the things you just have to accept. And then we need to bring back into the tender system things like price, quality, and of course the capacity to deliver. By removing price as a key criteria in terms of choosing or electing your tenders, you have basically opened government up for a tremendous amount of exploitation and a tremendous amount of corruption. And then finally, we need to actually hold someone accountable. We have more than enough evidence. The work has been done by the Zondo Commission. If you look at them today, they look absolutely exhausted. There are reels and reels of evidence. It's now up to the MPA to get their act together and actually go to court. So that's one key thing I would like to see. The other key thing, of course, is if we want to grow, we need to fix our electricity situation. We are here currently in a situation where this economy is probably going to contract by 8%, which is the steepest contraction we would have since the Great Depression. All right, so that's in the 1930s. And so the bottom line is that you cannot grow if you don't have electricity. And in this weak situation, Eskom cannot cope. Now, I've been to a presentation or hosted one in which Anton de Ruyter was talking about the consequences and Eskom's future path. And they are doing, essentially maintenance. But he pointed out that we are probably going to have to live with an increased chance of load shedding over stage 2 until we get to around November next year. Well, that just eliminates any possibility of a convincing recovery. So without reliable and cost-effective electricity, we simply cannot grow. We cannot have fixed investment. And if we can't have fixed investment, we can't create jobs. And from government's perspective, if you can't create jobs, you don't create taxpayers. So the bottom line is, this is a trap we do need to solve. And the solution is open it up. Stop trying to protect monopolies, just open it up to competition. End of the story. And if there's a private firm that can provide electricity cost effectively, they will do so. And at the end of the day, you will have a better electricity market. The next thing that I kind of identified that matters tremendously, I think, and that has been a big factor in undermining really just confidence in the South African economy, both domestically and globally, is this notion of expropriation without compensation. So we've already changed the constitution, but it's not clear. It's not clear exactly what the implications of this is. There's an expropriation bill, but there are many contentious issues in that expropriation bill. What we need to do is to make it crystal clear what are the boundaries of expropriation without compensation. And we need to make it crystal clear that private property rights will be protected. If you look at this graph, I'm showing you house prices versus interest rates. You can see property prices have been stagnant and drifting sideways for an extended period of time. We have a situation in South Africa where property is probably cheaper than it's ever been. The value you can get is absolutely astounding for the price, and interest rates are at near record lows. Normally in a market where you have that sort of situation, it would be screaming, buy, upgrade your property, move into the house you enjoy or you've always dreamt of, and yet it's not happening. So why is it not happening? Again, it's policy, and that's creating so much uncertainty that your normal price and interest rate signals are not actually functioning and helping the economy to recover. Then our biggest challenge over the next decade, we're not going to get rid of this challenge in a hurry, is of course the fact that government's finances have deteriorated dramatically. Level 5 lockdown, which was bizarrely strict according to the Johns Hopkins University in the United States, the strictest lockdown in the whole world, right? The whole world. So we're very special. We win that prize. Unfortunately, the consequences for government and for this economy has been devastating. And the outcome, of course, is that government revenue will implode, and with the deterioration in the economy and with the need to deal with the virus, you are going to see, of course, a very sharp acceleration in government expenditure. And this is going to be the challenge in the years ahead. Government will have to bring this budget back in line with the size of the economy. The deficit's going to be close to 15%, or slightly over 15% of GDP this year. Then it's going to float around that 10% level for the next 2 years. So essentially, what can they do? Well, there's only two things they can do. Well, there are three things. They can grow the economy. If they follow this advice, it might just happen. Secondly, they have to cut government spending. Where do they have to start? They have to start at the public sector wage bill. This graph up here shows you employment in South Africa. The green line is in fact public sector employment. The red line is the poor private sector. You can see how big the public sector has become relative to the private sector. But remember, the private sector generates your final taxpayers. So how was that funded? We know now. It was funded through debt, okay, through a massive escalation in debt. Now, in a recession like this, you don't want to be retrenching people. But that means that you simply have to say to them, listen, we won't retrench you, but you have to also share a bit of the burden here. And that burden is perhaps that you don't take a pay increase, that you don't get a 13th check, and that you bring the public sector wage bill in terms of public sector wage increases under control. And you can see in the private sector, there's been tremendous austerity, but in the public sector, that's not been the case at all. It's just ran out of control, even during Ramaphosa's reign. So it's time that this been brought under control. Inflation is only 3.2%. Only a few months ago, we were talking about inflation of over 4.5%. We're now at 3.2%. Why do you have such an enormous acceleration in public sector pay? So this is going to be their challenge, and they're just going to have to face the unions down. This is a battle they absolutely have to win. The IMF financing that they've secured now, it comes with no conditionality and at a very, very favorable interest rate because it is emergency funding for COVID purposes specifically. It's going to help them fund this deficit, this gigantic, frightening deficit this year. But next year, we start all over again. So unless they actually make fundamental changes and they stick to their guns, all right, essentially, we're going to run into a funding problem again somewhere down the line. And then we might have to go to the IMF for formal budget assistance. And when we get to that point, you are going to have these changes imposed on you. It's going to be a lot harsher. It's going to be a lot more painful. So you might as well be preemptive and do it in a way that you can control it and you can minimize the damage. So that's one thing I would obviously want to see happen. The final thing that I think needs to be done is that we need to relook our regulation. It's been one of the most damaging elements of the South African economy. You've often heard businesses say we want policy certainty, policy certainty. Well, what do they mean? They mean things like the visa regulations. Now, we've made changes to that. We took forever to do that. They mean things like mining, the mining charter. And it's not just there. It really is in every single industry affecting South Africa. Red tape, regulation, very onerous. Your compliance cost alone is incredibly expensive. And a lot of this regulation has unintended consequences. It either raises the cost of undertaking investment in South Africa, or it adds to the risk, and therefore it undermines confidence in the economy. So I think a review of regulation needs to be done. There have been a few good ones done that were largely ignored, so go back to those, don't start from scratch. Add the new regulation to it, evaluate it, do a cost-benefit analysis. Ask yourself the question, does it serve a purpose? If it doesn't, because a lot of it doesn't, scrap it. If it does serve a purpose, then does it carry any unintended costs? Does it distort prices? Does it raise barriers to entry and undermine competition? Does it facilitate corruption? Does it raise the cost of investment to the private sector? Does it add to the risk premium? Does it increase an element of uncertainty that is incredibly off-putting to attracting both local and foreign capital and fixed investment in the process? If really the benefits outweigh the cost, try and minimize the cost. But if the costs outweigh the benefits, simply scrap it. It serves no purpose and start all over again. So those would be my 5 recommendations, my humble advice. And I think it would make an enormous difference to confidence, and it would prove to everybody in this country, to investors and to global investors, that South Africa is serious about restructuring.
Nicky, thank you so much for that. That was great. And I've got one little quick question for you. I am trying to keep on time, so we'll just keep it brief. But just obviously this week, just the day before yesterday, I think we saw the NEC meeting and the Integrity Commission and President Ramaphosa going to go and sit in front of it, and their whole sort of decision now that if you're facing corruption, you need to step down from your role, etc. Do you think that that is going to help? I mean, is that sort of the first step in the right direction with corruption, do you think? And will that help build enough trust, I guess, with the South African public on that matter, or do they need to go much further than that?
No, I think it certainly is the first step in the right direction, but they can't stop there. I think firstly, the MPA has to take a lot of this evidence to court. People need to be charged. The trials need to start. And from government's perspective, for example, and from the ANC's perspective, if you are charged with corruption, and say those charges come through, then we need to see somebody actually step down or be forced to be stepped down. Because we've often heard this, even during Zuma years. Zuma did a lot of speeches about fighting corruption at every angle. So we've been in that bizarre situation. We now actually need to see an example, and that's the only way that you are going to convince people you are serious.
Yep, I agree with you, and yeah, let's see what happens. So, Nicky, thank you very much. I thought your 5 points were spot on, as I mentioned it to you. And I really hope that I think you sit on some of those forums that deal with business, government, etc. And I hope you will do that same presentation to them. They only need 15 minutes. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to having you back at our next webinar in a few months' time.